Hello. Okay. Picking up from last time, uh, I'd like to begin by doing another review question. And this time, uh, the question is why did dissent in Indian history almost invariably take a religious form? So, in answering this review question, um, I think one should begin by noting that Indian culture from virtually the start until the 19th century was virtually completely religious. Uh, from the time of the Aryans um, and the Veda literature forward, right through the Hindu period, um, the literature produced um, had a religious form. Furthermore, we know that the Brahmins, who first appear during the period of the kingdoms, uh, beginning of the Iron Age, 1000 BC to 600, uh, they increasingly monopolized cultural expression, and their culture was um, completely religious. And so, what literature they produced in the afterwards took on a religious form. It was important because it gave them dominant position in Hindu society. And we note further that then coming to the question of dissent, that um, during the period of the empires, um, we have the development of Buddhism and Jainism. These two, I would call them universalistic, in contrast uh, to Hinduism, universalistic religions. Um, there was an initial underlying protest against the development of castes in English society dominated by the Brahmins. And Jainism and Buddhism can be seen as protest movements. If not in directly in social terms, that in religious terms, the soul was able to free itself from the chains of caste by taking multiple forms, um, hopefully leading to a state of eternal bliss. Um, Now, of course, the Brahmins remain dominant, and we see that um, this, in fact, um, this dominance fully established itself during the Dark Age between 600 AD and 1200 AD. The what had been the Varnas fully became the caste system, putting the Brahmins with their religious and temple control at the top of society. Then came the military Rajputs, then the peasant farmers, and finally the outcasts. Um, this reinforced by the fact that Indian society during the Dark Age became based on these autarkic villages, this deep localism, that meant that Hinduism was deeply entrenched, fully entrenched in Indian society, and could not be dislodged even by the violence of the initial Muslim invasions of the 10th and 11th centuries. Um, so um, uh, Indian society was therefore very religious. And this was reinforced by the Muslim invasions from the 8th, the 10th, and the 11th century onwards on until the Mughal invasion. You have basically Muslim dominance over a Hindu majority, and the difference between the conquerors and the conquered takes a religious form. There is this religious difference between these two groups. Therefore, and of course, Islam was as religious, if not more religious, than Hinduism, so that any kind of dissent would assume a religious form. And furthermore, the alternative was a kind of secular class movement, say peasant-based protests, as you see, say, in Europe or later on in China. Well, classes could not develop in this kind of society. It was caste-ridden, religiously dominated, and therefore the religious movements that did emerge, even the protest movements, took a religious form. Now, we do see, following the Mughal invasion of the 16th century, that a form of individualist religious dissent does develop in the form of the so-called Bhakti movements, which it did spread to a certain extent amongst the Muslims, but it was particularly strong amongst the Hindus. And this was a sort of a form of protest, which became current amongst the lower castes in Indian society. And it was, in contrast to Hinduism, which was polytheistic, it was monotheistic. And instead of the elaborate rituals and prayers based on the obscure or abstruse Sanskrit language controlled by the Brahmins, it was in the simple vernaculars, songs, poetry, prayers, and the simple vernacular accessible to the common people, that this Bhakti movement developed. And consequently, it represented a kind of individualist protest. But we see already in the 16th century with Nanak, one of the important Bhakti prophets, that you have an actual movement, a protest movement, namely the Sikhs develop as a kind of protest movement combining elements of Hinduism, certainly, and also Islam, into this new religion, the Sikh religion. And certainly it came to be tolerated, especially under Akbar and his immediate successors, but it was certainly a protest movement. And then finally, in the latter half of the 17th, beginning of the 18th century, you do see the beginnings of really serious discontent amongst the lower classes, reacting to the heavy taxes and the religious persecution of Aurangzeb, this powerful Mughal emperor. You do get, first of all, you do have the revolt of the Hindus in in central Western India, the so-called Maratha movement in that area. In northern India, you have the Satnami movement, which is clearly based on the teachings of Kabir, the founder of Bhakti. You have the Jats, Jats, the Jats, which are a kind of lower class movement. again influenced by Bhakti. And so this movement, protesting taxes and religious persecution, takes the form of diverse sectarian religious groups rather than becoming a class movement. I would say that in terms of the base of these movements, certainly with peasants and artisans, the leaders almost invariably were zamindars. It was the zamindars who were the leaders of these protest movements. Well, I think I've covered the ground. In fact, this particular review question actually brings us to the content of the lecture, because the late 17th century, as I said, you have these various religious sects and movements amongst the Hindu majority protesting the Mughal rule. And by the end of the reign of Aurangzeb, the Mughal Empire began to fall apart. Let's see if I can. Just a second. Okay, let me see if I can get the hold on, folks. Okay. So this is frustrating. Well, so the Mughal Empire began to fall apart. And as a result, some of the Mansabdars or some of the Zamindar leaders basically began to declare their virtual independence from the Mughal emperor. By the opening years of the 18th century, state after state began to break away from the Mughal Empire and declare their independence, which was very important because it fundamentally weakened the Mughal Empire, and it opened the way basically for the intrusion of the Europeans And of course, amongst those Europeans, there certainly were the Dutch, there were the French, but above all, it was the English who took advantage of the weakness of the Mughal Empire. Now, we're at the point, that is to say, the late 17th, early 18th century. Looking at things more globally, we can see that England was becoming increasingly powerful. We have the reality that England in the late 17th century is engaged in a life and death struggle with Louis XIV, if you'll remember. And because of its armies, because of its navies, because of its strong state, all founded on the incredible development of English capitalism, which gives the English state enormous resources, the English are becoming dominant in Europe. And also, of course, from the colonial point of view, they're gaining traction in the West Indies, in Latin America, and eventually in Canada. And so the events in India have to be seen in the light of the overall global expansion of the British. Now, meanwhile, in Asia, the situation in Asia also has to be seen as changing. What we see in the 17th century is that certainly overall, Asian merchants were still important, and they were going to remain important until the middle of the 18th century. England was not going to be able to establish its dominance in Asia until the middle of the 18th century. And Asian merchants were still largely independent. It changes after that because the English or the British do become dominant even in Asia. However, in the 17th century, the main change is that the Portuguese lose control of their empire, their presence in Asia. They retain certainly Goa in India and also Macau in China as little colonies, but the Dutch basically take over. The Dutch basically take charge of Indonesia, this gigantic series of islands, and control the spice trade. They also take over what had been a Portuguese colony, Sri Lanka or Ceylon, falls into the hands of the Dutch. And they also have trading posts here and there in India. So the Dutch become predominant to the point, I would say, that even when the English, who are beginning to, at the beginning of the 17th century, they're beginning to become more important. This is the period of the early Stuarts still. When the English try to move in on the Dutch in Indonesia, the Dutch defeat them. The Dutch, however the smaller country it was, had such a strong navy, such a strong merchant marine and finances that the English at this stage could not defeat the Dutch. And in fact, they were humiliated by the Dutch in Indonesia in the 1620s. So the English took another approach, at least at the beginning. Now, the main instrument, of course, of their advance into Asia was the English East India Company. The English East India Company was the instrument of the advance of the English. And this company, like the Dutch East India Company, were the first corporations. They were veritable corporations as the distant ancestor of the modern corporation, because they were limited liability companies. investors would invest in the hopes of making a profit. And the board of directors was responsible to the investors. But the investors were not immediately liable for the debts of the company. And so this truly was a private, a new kind of private enterprise, a new way of pooling capital, we can say. Before this, there had only been partnerships, and partnerships brought with liability. This was different. In any case, the English at first kept strictly to trade when concerned with India. They set up as many trading posts as they could, and they were above all interested in basically, in return for especially gold, but also maybe some weapons and some metals, getting Indian cottons, which, as I explained, in the 17th century conquered the world market. And in Europe, there was an incredible thirst for Indian cotton goods, which were very beautifully manufactured. And in terms of clothing, but also in terms of household furniture, covering furniture or making drapes, cotton goods were preferred. So this was an incredible opportunity for English merchants, but England as a whole suffered a balance of trade deficit with India as a result. Trade balance was negative. But the English played by local rules. They set up as many trading posts as they could, but they obeyed the local rules. They worked with the local merchants. They obtained the favor and protection of local rulers. Remember, by the beginning of the 18th century, the emperor has lost control, and these local rulers now are calling the tune. So that's the way the English begin. But as the 18th century rolls on, by the 1720s, the decline of the Mughals is evident. The Mughals, because of their overexploitation, because of the consequent political and religious revolts led by local princes or zamindars, because of the discontent of the people who suffered from heavy taxation and vast inequality, the Mughal Empire disintegrated and India became open to foreign invasion. Now, by the middle of the 18th century, the English had no less than 150 trading posts along the coasts, the east and west coasts of India, so-called factories, where the English merchants were busy exporting cotton, but also silks, muslin, sugar, rice, saltpeter, and opium. I underscore opium because it plays an important role later on. All of these things were being exported by the English East India Company, and in fact, it became active in Asian trade as well as the Atlantic trade. Now, in the middle of the 18th century, a big war broke out between France and England. It was a veritable world war because it was fought out in the Caribbean, in Canada, in North America. This is the war between 1756 and 1763. It was fought on the high seas and on these different continents, and India was one of the areas where there was an intense struggle between the French and the British. But to come to the particular, it was especially in Eastern India, in and around Calcutta, that the local ruler allied himself with the Nabob of Calcutta, of Bengal, the Nabob of Bengal. He allied himself with the British, and he basically put into question the British right to control Calcutta, which was their main factory in India. And so the British, in retaliation, basically decided to get rid of this Nabob and install somebody who was more amenable, basically install some sort of a puppet as the Nabob. And so war broke out between this local potentate and the English, and the Nabob of Bengal called upon the French, who were located in southern India, mainly, to help to defend him. And so a climactic battle occurred at a place called Plassey, which is in Bengal, in 1757. The East India Company had its own army, which fought according to European methods, largely made up of English soldiers. And you had French soldiers present, as well as local Indian soldiers. And the English, or the English East India Company, because it was not, the company was actually fighting this war, defeated the French. And the French, basically were subordinated to the English in India as a result. And at this point then, the English got rid of the Nabob, put in somebody who was more pliable, and they began a conquest of the whole of northeastern India. Using their troops, no doubt, but also allying themselves with other local rulers. The Indian subcontinent was already divided, but now taking advantage of this division, the English divided and conquered the Indian subcontinent because, well, the English army was militarily superior, but also they also allied with local rulers to their advantage. Now, the Indians actually put up quite a good resistance, but nevertheless, the English prevailed. And by 1818, it was all over, and the English East India Company basically controlled the Indian subcontinent. An amazing new reality, fast. And meanwhile, in the course of these wars, as I say, which continued between 1757 and 1818, wars of conquest, the English proceeded to basically gather an immense plunder. Anything that moved, that especially gold, they took. They forced the local rulers, the local populations, to pay all kinds of ransoms and bribes, aside from the normal tax revenues. And as a result, the English East India Company and its officers privately grew immensely rich as a result. There were immense fortunes that were made by Englishmen through the conquest of India, which was, as I say, a brutal pillaging of India, took place uh, under the aegis of this company. Um, and this plunder, if you like, a lot of it went back to India in the form of gold, because the Indians have been accumulating gold for centuries. As you can understand, since the 16th century, there's been this enormous buildup of gold in India. Well, the English basically took it all, and it played a huge role in finance. It went into the banks in England. It played a huge role in financing the Industrial Revolution, but also in the form of bonds, it helped the English government to win the world wars against the French. The War of 1756 to 63, but also the subsequent French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. A lot of the bonds that were raised came from the gold that was derived from India. So India helps England to consolidate its world power as a result. The Industrial Revolution and the successful wars of the French Revolution are largely financed as a result of this Indian plunder. Now, that was the immediate consequence of the English conquest. But also, what the English did in the opening years of the 19th century was they destroyed step by step, they destroyed the Indian cotton manufacturing industry, which, as I said, had conquered the world market, had conquered the European market. Well, the English, by the late 18th, beginning of the 19th century, set up their own cotton factories in England, and they imposed new tariffs on India, which blocked the import of Indian tariffs, inhibited manufacturing in India, and promoted English cotton textiles. And so the English cotton textiles, which were of good quality and cheap, basically conquered the Indian market, and the Indian textile manufacturing industry fell into complete decay. The English East India Company also began to take over the Asian trade. From the time of the initial conquest, the English East India Company, we can say, began to control the whole of the Asian trade. And in particular, the English were interested in opening up the trade with China. And they began to ship opium and cotton from India to China, which proved to be a lucrative market that the English were intent on developing. The rest of this story comes with my discussion of China in the next week. Then we can say the English did some good things in India. Don't get me wrong. In the 19th century, the English set up an education system in India, which proved to be very successful. It was a modern educational system. And they also built the Indian National Railway, which unified all of India for the first time. Those were, the British did this for their own purposes, but nevertheless, it was very important. These things are very important in ultimately giving birth to an Indian middle class. However, as I've already indicated, the railway system was basically entirely built in England, shipped out, and there was no economic development attendant on the development of the English National Railway within India. They destroyed the cotton industry, and um, they they also established um, they basically dismantled the the whole sort of property relationships that existed under the Mughals. They introduced private property, private property for landlords, and this is really the beginning of the class system in India, um, which admittedly gave India a certain dynamism from this point onwards. However, I would say that overall, the English mercilessly exploited India. There was really little or no economic development during the English period. And you can see this clearly from the fact that in 1756, we know this because this has been calculated, India's share of the world gross domestic product was 26%. It's a very large country. Obviously, the productivity was low, but India produced 26% of the world's goods in 1756. In 1949, the year of India's independence from the British, India produced only 4% of world GDP. And I would note that since independence, the situation has very much improved. The reality of Indian control over their own economy has made all the difference, throwing out off the yoke of the Mughal Empire and, of course, feudalism, but also throwing off the yoke of the British was important in emancipating the Indian economy. So I think that marks really all I have to say about the early modern history of India. I want now to turn to the history of China. And let me begin by sort of remarking again, or taking note of the world situation. The English conquest of India, which was completed by 1818, marks a definite turning point. England by 1818 was clearly the most powerful country in the world. Tiny nation, it's incredible, ruling over this enormous empire. England, following the defeat of the French, following the defeat of Napoleon, was dominant in Europe, and as a result of its empire, its navies and armies essentially was the most powerful country in the world. And of course, we have to understand that this was all based on the industrial and financial power of English capitalism. I already remarked on the fact that the English East India Company now controlled the trade in Asia. But China, I would say, was still the greatest in sheer population. Was the largest country on earth at this point. It had perhaps as many as 350 or 400 million people at the beginning of the 19th century. This Chinese empire, the first signs of it, the first signs of Chinese civilization date from around 2700 BC, more or less contemporary with the emergence of civilization in India. In fact, China has a continuous history from about 2700 BC. And we can say that China became a unified country um, between 200 BC and 200 AD. This is the period of the Qin and Han dynasty, contemporaneous with the emergence of the Roman Empire, which unified the whole of the basically the Mediterranean and European world round about 200 BC to 200 AD. The same thing happened in China. The Qin and Han dynasties basically unified China between 200 BC and 200 AD. Furthermore, while the Roman Empire disintegrated from the 3rd century AD, and at least Europe entered into a dark age, China went from strength to strength, because it's precisely in the Dark Ages, what we call the Western Dark Ages, between the 7th and 11th centuries AD, between the 7th and 11th century, that China in some ways reached its, in the ancient China reached its peak with the Tang and the Sung dynasties between the 7th and the 11th century AD. The Chinese Empire reached its veritable peak. And certainly we can say that from a economic point of view, but also from a technological point of view, China was way in advance of Europe in the so-called Dark Ages, and essentially all through the Dark Age. It really, this Chinese superiority from an economic and technological point of view compared to Europe lasts until really the 17th century. Furthermore, it was during the 13th century, actually a period when China was occupied by the Mongols. Nevertheless, this was the period when the Mongols, who came from Central Asia, of course, the Mongols who ruled China for over a century, this is Genghis Khan and so on. This was the period when the so-called Silk Road was established in the 13th century. Basically, the road across Central Asia, which brought Chinese luxury goods, above all the silks of China, were brought to Europe for the first time across the steppes of Central Asia. This was basically done under Chinese Mongolian auspices in the 13th century, and the Silk Road continued to be a factor between the 13th and latter half of the 16th century. It was the primary route to reach India, to reach Asia, until the West Europeans basically opened up the Atlantic route. This is, and I would say that all through this period, if there was a center of world commerce, it was China. China was not only the most populated, but also economically the most successful country in the world until the 17th century. Furthermore, the West, which of course began to emerge at the beginning of the 16th century, gunpowder, printing, the compass, and agricultural, all sorts of agricultural implements, all came from China. So Chinese inventions played a huge role in terms of facilitating the rise of the West. Well, what we can say is this, of course, changed in the course of the 17th century, the full emergence of the West. The West, step by step, as you see, will gradually took over. But in order to sort of conclude our discussion today, we see that this Chinese dominance, of course, ended. The West took over, and the West became ascendant until the Chinese Revolution in 1949. But we see today that as a result of the Chinese Revolution, China is resuming, we can't absolutely predict this, but it looks like China is basically bound to become, most observers predict, that China will become the dominant economy in the world in the 21st century. It has 4 times the population of the United States and is highly developed, and the people have a very high level of education and culture. And furthermore, the Chinese have gone so far, as I think I explained at the beginning of this class, to reopen the Silk Road. Part of the enormous wealth that China has basically gained in these last decades is being invested in basically developing, in a modern sense, the whole route between China and Western Europe. The new Silk Road is developing as I speak. Now, my last comment in this sort of opening discussion about China is that China is developing based on a mix of public and private enterprise. As you know, China considers itself to be a communist country. There is, in effect, a mix of public and private enterprise. The rise of China is, of course, being resisted by the West and led by the United States. And certainly we can expect under the new president of the United States a renewed effort to contain and subordinate China. But I think that Chinese development, based on this enormous population, highly developed population, I don't really believe that this can be stopped. And certainly the Silk Road is going to make it very difficult for the United States to contain China. Now, I would conclude by noting that, in fact, the United States remains committed to this notion, in contrast to China, which is all about the mix of private and public enterprise. The United States is committed to basically the idea of free markets and using its military in order to contain China. And this can be summed up in this ideology of neoliberalism, which basically is exactly that. It's a new form of liberalism. Liberalism is an 18th century philosophy. It goes back to Adam Smith. And it's basically about having a free market and basically a strong military. It is, in effect, at this point, I would argue, the United States is attempting to renew its basic principles. It's an attempt at a traditionalist revival, is what I would say. It's a traditionalist revival, in the same way as the sultans in this Mehmed IV attempted to revive the Ottoman Empire on the basis of religious crusade, religious jihad. The United States has attempted to revive itself on the basis of its founding principles. And this is, as I said, laissez-faire liberalism. We will see what the outcome is. Personally, I believe that this ideology is outmoded. But we'll resume the actual narrative in the next class. Thank you very much.